Hi there. For this particular video, we're going to be looking at formalist film critical theory. The formalists, like the structuralists, were more concerned with the idea of how something was made, rather than the contents of what it was made with. The difference between the formalist and the structuralist is that the structuralist wanted to know, comparing and contrasting to other stories that are similar to it, what patterns do we notice? The formalists were more worried about the decisions that a filmmaker would make. Why did they do this? Why did they do that instead of this? Why did they film this particular scene in this way? Does it match up with the patterns that we've seen in the past? So the formalists were obsessed with the idea of the organization, the style and stylistic techniques, and all of the devices that any particular storyteller might use in order to craft their tale. A formalist would notice these videos that I'm making to you, and rather than focus on the content, they would look at the fact that I always choose a different setting, I'm always wearing a different set of clothes and costume, there's always some premise or conceit that's happening that allows me to be able to share it with you in a slightly different way, usually some sort of allegory or symbol. They know and they will pick up on the idea that I will always talk about the theory at the beginning in very general terms, and then I'm going to use the film model as an example. For a formalist, this is their bread and butter. For a formalist, this is exactly the type of things that they're going to be watching for. For a formalist, these shapes that I'm using are the most important thing, not necessarily the words coming out of my mouth. One might suspect that a formalist would be very interested in the film The Congress, and that's true for two reasons. We'll talk about the first one right now. By definition, this film does fit a particular pattern. It has elements of a quest film, it has elements of a self-discovery film, and it has elements of a film that is a traditional science fiction drama. It doesn't mean that it has to follow those forms to the letter. If you look at the essence of what's happening in the story, you have a woman who has a decision to make. We see scenes in which those decisions and the complications around them and why she chooses what she chooses get shown to us. Slowly but surely, decision after decision, she comes to a point in which she has to go on a journey. The first decision, of course, is the idea that she chooses to sell her image of herself in order for her to take care of her family. 20 years later, we have her having to decide whether she's going to renew her contract. She chooses instead to stand up and fight back, trying as hard as she can to be a part of a revolution she wasn't even completely sure was taking place. The next decision she makes is that she, after falling in love with the animator Dylan, decides to go back to the real world to try to find her son. She succeeds. Through the trials and tribulations that happen, she finds out that her son is lost deep into the chemical world and may not be found again. So she once again decides to go back in, this time as her son, in order to find him. Now, a formalist would say, content-wise, in terms of what I'm talking about, it might sound crazy, but that's not the point. You have decision, action, consequence, decision, action, consequence. And the way that those aspects and elements are filmed is exactly what a formalist would be interested in. The second element, and for this, one second, I may need to change up my style a little bit. Perfect. The second element deals with what formalists like to refer to as that which is familiar versus that which breaks the familiar ground. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean it has to be interesting or intriguing, although that does help. What they were looking at was not so much whether it was interesting content. They were looking at whether or not we broke the form. Familiarity has a side effect. We all know it. If you're familiar with something, you see your bedroom, the last 60 days it hasn't really changed much, all of a sudden something were to change, you would notice. The formalists supported the idea that an artist or an author or a filmmaker should break up that familiarity to wake us up. That true art should realistically kind of slap us in the face because we're expecting something, because it fades into the background of what we always expect, but now is doing something different. The formalists were also really in love with the idea of the fact that we know that we're watching a movie. which means if you break that down, if you were to throw that around, if you were to turn it on us, and so all of a sudden we knew that we were watching a movie, and all of a sudden they were making reference to the movie that we're watching. Or there's a movie within a movie. Or, like here, Robin Wright is the actress playing Robin Wright in this particular circumstance. They make a joke about the fact that she refuses to do sci-fi movies, even though we're watching a sci-fi film. All of a sudden we go into a cartoon world, which gets into even trippier territory when we get into the chemical world, because the animation begins to shapeshift and change. It does have familiar content to us. We recognize certain patterns and certain faces and certain icons and certain paintings are being referenced all the way throughout this film, but that's not the point. The point is that this movie now switches from a live-action drama to something that you weren't expecting. It changes genres in order to continue to craft its story. And then that shifts again because stylistically, the animation goes from cartoonish 1950s, 1960s style animation to all of a sudden very abstract and very surrealist type of an art. Those elements are waking us up. Those are forms that are being used. The story still has its plot. It still has its decisions, consequences, actions, and reactions. But at its core, stylistically, we're being smacked in the face. Formalists like it when storytelling draws your attention to something that you normally wouldn't notice. From a cinematic perspective, you're dealing with things like extreme close-ups or slow motion, something that you normally wouldn't see or perceive. In this film, we get lots of extreme close-ups, but we also have the perception of sound from the point of view of the son, Aaron. Him losing his hearing, we often get a sound cue which helps us to empathize with what he's going through. That type of a break in what we're used to helps, although the formalist would argue that sometimes film does require a bit of empathy, so the way that someone sees something or hears something can be shared with us in that particular way. But it does wake us up to the idea of the fact that we are not really following along from every character's point of view. We are not only watching this from the third person. We are not only watching this as omniscient viewers. We are being a part of what's going on. We are a part of the cartoon world and the chemical world, and we are a part of Aaron's perceptions of the world, and we are following along, and by the end, we are seeing things from the point of view of Robin through her son's eyes. One of the key lines in this movie that the formalist would have absolutely loved is a line from one of the robots trying to explain to Robin Wright while she's in the hotel exactly how things work. They said, ultimately everything makes sense and everything is in your mind. The forms that we're used to come about in a way that we structure patterns in order to be able to conceive and perceive the world. Storytellers and filmmakers have relied upon a certain language to be able to share that with us. Formalists say the ability to analyze a movie is to be able to read through those structures and through those forms in order to be able to make sense of what's taking place. They also say that if you can break free of those every once in a while to snap yourself out of the familiar, then that might be true art. By that definition, the Congress is definitely art.